transmisión de YouTube del SEICH UNAM. Queremos darles la bienvenida a una mesa más del ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica, coordinada por el doctor Francisco Vergara Silva, que me acompaña aquí en este momento. Tenemos el gusto de estar juntos desde el piso 5 del SEICH, haciendo esta transmisión virtual para todas y todos ustedes. Como ustedes bien saben, este evento es organizado por el SEICH de la UNAM, por SURXE, que es el Seminario de Racismo y Xenofobia, coordinado por la doctora Olivia Gall, y por el Instituto de Biología, al cual está adscrito también el doctor Francisco. Digo que quizás lo saben bien porque esta es ya la 8ª mesa del ciclo, que inició ya hace 2 años. Este es el 3er año y la 8ª mesa de estos conversatorios, y nos da mucho gusto que sigan aquí conversando con nosotras, con nosotros. Como ustedes han escuchado, pues el objetivo general de esta mesa siempre ha sido poder reflexionar sobre problemáticas contemporáneas, ¿no?, en el campo de la ciencia, especialmente desde la antropología biológica, pero también desde otras disciplinas, y pensar un poco en las problemáticas contemporáneas del racismo en este campo, pero sobre todo en las posibilidades, necesidades y horizontes de hacer una sociedad y un quehacer científico antirracista. Hago esta presentación en español, pero de inmediato nos vamos a pasar a hablar en inglés, puesto que nuestra invitada el día de hoy, la profesora Lisa Gannett, va a tener esta conversación con el doctor Francisco en inglés, y esperamos a la brevedad poder tener esta transmisión subtitulada por si la gustan volverla a ver. Quizás ya con ese recurso sea más sencillo para todas y todos acceder a la información. Y bueno, entonces repito, discúlpenme, pero repito un poquito lo mismo en inglés. Welcome everyone to this eighth session of the cycle of conversations about race, racism, and biological anthropology, which is coordinated by the Dr. Francisco Vergara Silva and co-organized by SEICH and SURXE of UNAM and the Institute of Biology of the University. We're very happy to have Professor Lisa Gannett with us today. So I'll just turn the microphone to Dr. Francisco Vergara so he can present our guest. And well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Jimena, for your introduction. As you were saying, this is the 3rd year in which we are carrying out this cycle of conversations. Usually, our sessions are informal and with people who we like a lot and who have done important work at different levels that brings together discussions, interdisciplinary discussions about race and racism with a connection to biological anthropology. So the subdiscipline of the anthropological sciences that has usually been dedicated to the study, to the analysis of the evolution of the human species and also the body, and in recent decades, evidently because of the way biology developed, issues that have to do with genetics and more recently genomics. So actually coming to that last mention that I am making now, Professor Lisa Gannett, who is our invited speaker today, has a long experience, very important, I would say, at an international level, from a philosophy of science perspective, which is her initial and foremost discipline of specialty, analyzing what is going on with concepts and notions that people working in the sciences, for instance, genomics, medical genomics, anthropological genetics, and many other configurations of biological practice and anthropological practice, what is going on with the way in which these scientists use concepts and what implications come from the use of such concepts, and also the practices that come together with them. So more formally, as a way of introduction, Professor Lisa Gannett works at the University of St. Mary's, which is located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and her interests, both as a researcher and as a teacher at the university, are on scientific method, science and society, philosophical issues in feminism, environmental ethics, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and feminist philosophy. So today, and after some conversation that we had with Lisa in preparation for this session, she will be talking about are socially constructed populations a problem for human genetics and genomics. This is part of research that Lisa is currently doing and has been presenting, and we've been presenting to audiences that are closely connected to the Philosophy of Science Association at the United States and in general in the North American region. And this is a continuation of work that Lisa has published in many important journals, international journals on the subject that we have already mentioned, such as Biology and Philosophy, Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Synthese, and many other publications that she might probably mention a bit later during the session. So the way we will work today is Lisa will present a talk as such, using a PowerPoint presentation to support what she will be saying. And after that, we will start to, as usual, to have a conversation with her on the points raised during the presentation. And then after that, we will open the session for questions from the audience, both people who are kindly now joining us in the Zoom room, and also people who might be looking at the session via YouTube. So please, Lisa, thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to see you in person very soon. But today, via Zoom. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of these conversations, and I will share my slide here again.
Okay.
All right. Just to say, I'm looking forward to the conversation because this is very much a work in progress that will benefit from discussions, from conversations with scholars from a range of disciplines. So I will be presenting this topic on a panel of 4 philosophers of science at the Philosophy of Science Association meeting in November in New Orleans, and that session will be on race, ethnicity, and ancestry in genomics. So this is a little bit of a first go round for that. So again, very much a work in progress, and I'll be appreciative of all the discussions that we have, and thank you for the lovely poster as well. Okay, so the talk is jumping off from and centered on the report that came out last year. It was by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States. And the report, as you can see, is on the use of population descriptors in genetics and genomics research. And it was a response to a request by the National Institutes of Health to take a look at the status of the use of race, ethnicity, ancestry, and other population descriptors. And it makes a series of recommendations, which I'll go over. And it certainly, those recommendations have been taken up by the National Institutes of Health. You can see for the National Human Genome Research Institute, they've enacted those. I'm going to go over some recommendations of the report, just the ones that are sort of relevant to what I have to say today. One is that race shouldn't be used as a proxy for human genetic variation, and race shouldn't be used to name genetic ancestry groups. They discuss typological thinking and just assumptions about hierarchy, homogeneity, the stability of groups over over time and problematize those kinds of assumptions. They tell researchers they should be aware of the connotations of the labels they use on the groups those labels name. They ask researchers to tailor the descriptors they choose to the purposes of the study and justify that choice in terms of those purposes. They ask that labels be consistently applied to participants in a given study. That's something that commentators have criticized, that studies are often a mishmash of labels, some racial, some ethnic, some national, some linguistic. So that's about consistency. And there's a chart that just as the recommendations involve, like, different kinds of research demand different ways of conceptualizing groups. They go through a number of different ways that often groups or population labels get used in genetics and genomics research. And you can see on this chart, they divide things into when you should use certain ways of conceptualizing things, for example, in terms of genetic similarity, geography, genetic ancestry, race, ethnicity. And you can see that racial classification in genetics and genomics is recommended entirely against on the very left there. The only exception is when race serves as a proxy for environmental variables that have to do with racism. The report considers geographical origins, ethnicity, and genetic ancestry to be appropriate categories for human evolutionary history. But as far as controlling, for example, for population stratification in say, gene discovery for complex traits, they recommend that genetic similarity be used instead, and caution be exercised in attaching geographic or ethnic or racial labels. They recognize that these there might be some difficulty in getting these recommendations taken up, and that there's going to be resistance in the scientific community, because they say that many scientists hold the view that race is a biological category, or that it's a useful proxy for human biological variation, and really that there's been a lot of literature on these issues for probably 20 years, and there's been a little uptake from similar efforts that have been undertaken. So there's an interesting recommendation that followed from closely from Graham Coop's presentation and participation in this process. He's a population and evolutionary geneticist at UC Davis and California. And the idea here is when, as an example of a particular area of research, gene discovery for complex and polygenic traits, the idea is to use similarity then, as I said before, with that recommendation, rather than ancestry per se. And the recommendation is that study participants be characterized in terms of genetic similarity to one another, or to a reference panel. And Coop has published his the paper that he used as part of his participation in this process. And so this is some passages from that paper in his recommendation that human genetics should move away from the concept of genetic ancestry groups and towards genetic similarity descriptors. And here he uses himself as an example. He thinks that simple statements of genetic similarity, such as this sample or haplotype is genetically similar to a particular sample in comparison to other samples in a particular way. For example, Graham is genetically similar to the GBR 1,000 genome samples on the first 10 principal components, rather than Graham has Northwestern European genetic ancestry. Now, I think there's power in this recommendation in the sense that it introduces a more conventional, approach. So rather than saying that, Graham is Northwestern European or has Northwestern European ancestry, he's being compared to a standard that is a particular set of samples in the 1,000 genome project. So there's some, degree of conventionality attached to that. So you can see that these on the right side, then these are the this is the 1,000 genome projects panel for GBR, which stands for British from England and Scotland, based on the donor, the parents, and the grandparents were all born in the United Kingdom. But the samples themselves were actually drawn from, just let me bring that up a little bit for you, from British individuals in Cornwall and Kent and Orkney and Argyll and Bute in Scotland. So from particular places, but with grandparents born anywhere in the UK. So just here are some slides from the 1,000 Genomes Project populations. And you can see that they are grouped in fairly conventional, regional, continental, continental regions. Sorry?
Classificatory categories, I was saying. No?
Are you good?
Yeah, everything fine.
Okay. So Europe, Americas, Africa, South Asia, East Asia. You can see, the map on the left, and then the particular populations that are the particular population and panels they have on the right. So, for example, Mexican ancestry in Los Angeles, California, is one of the groups. And just to give you, an idea then of several of the groups, this one then is, having trouble seeing a little bit. This is Tuscany in Italia, and their grandparents, 3 of 4 grandparents, had to be born in Tuscany. You have, these are Mende and Sierra Leone, and here are the Mexican ancestry in Los Angeles, where 3 of 4 grandparents had to be born in Mexico. But you can see that this is a really limited move to genetic similarity. It's still couched in terms of ancestry that is attached to ethnicity, nationality, and race. So there is a conventionality perhaps that mitigates against some of that, but there's also a recognition from the committee that even once you've expressed your subjects in terms of genetic similarity to one of these reference panels, they may be, more or less close to them, and you may therefore want also to add a label based on ethnicity or nationality or geography, and then they just caution that be circumspect about those choices and justify them. So, to my thinking, that's not quite genetic similarity, right? I mean, genetic similarity is just genetic similarity with genomes compared to one another, and often, of course, similar genomes are taken to be similar because they have shared ancestry. But that's not necessarily the case. There can be convergent evolution, and this is something that John Fujimura and Ramya sorry, I should have practiced that. Rajagopal argued some time ago in this 2011 paper that they studied researchers using GWAS, and it saw that their statistical methods, lent themselves to carrying out the control for called population stratification using just genetic similarity, but there was nevertheless a slippage towards shared ancestry. And then, how do you express shared ancestry without recourse to geography or genealogy, which then became interpreted as racial or ethnic? So one, there is that opportunity to use just simply genetic similarity. The report seems to go just partway towards that by saying the similarity will still be in terms of proximity to this set of samples, for example, from the 1,000 Genome Project. And as these authors say, there's often difficulty in practice in staying within confines like that, even when they're possible. So one thing that's important is to realize that genetic ancestry is being seen as, sort of the answer to the problems that have attached to the use of race and ethnicity in human genetics and genomics research. So, for example, these articles by Roberts, Tishkoff, and Sal and Udall, one of them 2016 and one of them 2020 with 70 signatories, really were prodding the NIH to do more and recommended the convening a committee from National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and recommended that ancestry be the group category that then replace race, describing it as a process-based concept, a statement about an individual's relationship to other individuals and their genealogical history, more personal about genomic heritage, avoids the hierarchical assumptions that have attached to the use of race, and recommends that scientific journals and professional societies encourage terms like ancestry or population to describe human groupings and genetic studies rather than race, and to limit race in biology to a social or political category that's used just to study racism and its biological effects, its role in generating health disparities. Both Tishkoff and Roberts were on the NASEM committee, and indeed, these recommendations did come through in the final in the final report. That is, to limit race in biology to a social or political category, to study racism and to focus instead on ancestry, on genetic ancestry. My concern is that genetic ancestry itself is kind of problematic, and we need to examine the ways in which that's so. So one thing that I found interesting about the report was all these concepts are seen as descent associated. So the report says the committee emphasizes that scientists must get the descent associated concepts right, that is, have a clear understanding of them, and race, ethnicity, indigeneity, geography, genetic ancestry, genetic similarity, they're all seen as descent associated. So we're sort of operating in genetics and genomics squarely within a sort of ancestry descent framework, but that's not the only way, to approach population genetics or genomics. So I like this article from, I think, back in 1997. Anthropologist Helen Macbeth was promoting a sort of a biosocial approach to recognize that there are biological aspects to ethnicity and ethnic groups, but she really problematized the notion of population. So she argued that the lack of discreteness that makes race problematic is mirrored in ethnic group and population. She looked at Dobzhansky's definition of a Mendelian population as a group within which the majority of individuals find mates for reproduction and the procreation of the next generation. And she emphasized that there's a lot of continuity in things like reproductive propensities for reproduction, and some of those problems then in defining and bounding populations have led to scientists to focus on isolates, because there they can find the boundaries they need to have a group that persists over time, that makes evolutionary studies possible. But I think what's particularly important is her emphasis that as far as Dobzhansky's definition of a Mendelian population goes, humans, she says, not only mate, they marry. Marriage rules are social rules. So I think when we look at ancestry as this possible genetic ancestry, as a possible solution to the problems with race and ethnicity in human genetics and genomics, it's important to remember that our genealogical ties, our social ties, are carved out within a social, a cultural, political frameworks. And I guess what I'm trying to argue here is there's no escaping, there's no sort of access to the biological that escapes the social, the cultural, the political, when it comes to doing human genetics and genomics. And just to also, that the point I made that we seem to squarely come into a framework that is entirely based on descent or ancestry, just compare that to Dobzhansky's definition of Mendelian population as a group in which the majority of individuals find mates for reproduction and procreation of the next generation. That is, he was interested in evolutionary processes, the mechanisms of evolution. It was a forward-looking approach rather than a backward-looking approach. So, it would allow for, describing populations as they're found now, and not trying to locate subjects within their trajectory, genealogical trajectory. Okay, so the NASM report defines race and ethnicity in entirely social, political, subjective, relative terms. So race is a socio-politically constructed system for classifying and ranking human beings according to subjective beliefs about shared ancestry and varies globally. Ethnicity is a socio-politically constructed system as well, varies globally as well. But when you come to the biological and the genetic, then it seems that we're able to escape the social, the political, the subjective, and the relative. That is, genealogical ancestors are the set of biological ancestors in an individual's family tree. Not all of the individual's genealogical ancestors are their genetic ancestors. That is, they don't have DNA that has originated in all the way along their family, the family tree. Genetic ancestry, rather, is those passed through the individual's family tree by which the individual has inherited DNA from specific ancestors. So, you know, we don't carry around DNA in ourselves that's come from all or even a majority of our ancestors, but only a subset. And it is this genetic ancestry that is the central, the recommended and central concept then for studies in human population genetics and genomics. And genetic similarity then is taken to reflect the extent of shared genetic ancestry. Similarly, this is the National Human Genome Research Institute that emphasizes again that race is a social construct, a political and social construct that is fluid, can change over time and place and context, has been established historically to establish a social, has been used historically to establish a social hierarchy. But when it comes to its discussions of human origins and ancestry, this is taken to be more, you know, objective. That we're able to more objectively define our ancestral origins, our genetic ancestry, in contrast. So what I'm interested in here is whether we can presume the extent of the access to sort of the fully biological, genetic, objective world beyond sort of the social, the political. This is an interesting study that there's been a number of important studies that are more sort of empirical work than what I do, and it's really valuable work because it you know, the ethnographies, the qualitative sociology, the interviews to find out how the scientists themselves are thinking, and what the possibility for uptake, for example, of some of these recommendations might be. And this study, I think, is really useful because it looks at epidemiologists as well as population geneticists, as well as clinical researchers who are working together, for example, in trying to study the contributions to complex diseases. And often they say the population geneticist, you know, sort of takes a little bit more of an authoritative role because of the technical aspects, but that their needs, how they conceive of the need to use race or ethnicity, for example, in recruiting and studying their subjects depends on whether they are a clinical researcher or an epidemiologist or a population geneticist. And the author's recommendation is that, if recommendations are being made, then uptake might differ depending on, which scientists are involved. This particular interview was with a population geneticist who says, when interviewed, well, I'm looking at race or ethnicity, and the answer is, I'm actually looking at neither. I'm looking at your genetic ancestry. And that in those terms, I'm only interested in the geography of where your genome came from. And as a scientist, I could care less how you define yourself. So there's an assumption here then that, science has access then to genetic ancestry as an objective measure, and that there's a geography of the genome that has nothing to do with how people understand or define themselves or others. But I think the report itself recognizes that there's a problem here. So when the population geneticist says, I'm only interested in the geography of where your genome came from, what the NASM report says is any description of the genetic ancestry of an individual entails a decision about the relevant time depth at which to describe it. In other words, there's no geography without history. How do you fix an individual or a genome to a place, or a gene or an allele to a place, without being clear about when? And when the population geneticist says, as a scientist, I could care less how you define yourself, that is, what you think your ethnicity or your race is, the report says any geographic or ethnic labeling requires that decisions be made about the appropriate level of resolution for the study. In many current studies, individuals have been defined in terms of continental ancestry on a time frame before the past 600 years before European global colonialism, and that's been a contingent choice, which I and many others have pointed out that that's a product of a decision that often scientists just take, like average people in society just take, the usual racial categories as given and don't interrogate them, and don't realize that they're making, socio-historically, politically situated choices when they decide on their group categories. And if there's no geography of the genome without history, and there's no geography without understanding then how we define ourselves in particular, at particular times in particular places. This is a diagram from the report. Talks about what ancestry is in a very general way: origin, descent, lineage, roots, heritage, kinship, pretty vague. What's important to this approach to genetics and genomics is the distinction between genealogical ancestors and genetic ancestry. The genealogical ancestors, as already said, being the set of biological ancestors they assume in an individual's family tree or pedigree, and genetic ancestry being the pathways through which DNA has been inherited from a relatively small subset of those genealogical ancestors. And on the diagram, what they're showing on the left is what you're seeing as individuals situated in different continents that have that going back a couple of thousand years actually share all their genealogical ancestors, And going back further, you get to the the most recent common ancestor of a particular segment of the genome, human, hominid, or beyond. So the idea then is this is what's more scientific and objective, and what we should study in population genetics and genomics. And this is just an example of a second-year course in human genetics for students, just to show this very genealogical sort of approach to genetics, which I think is different than what would have been the case 20 years ago. I mean, I know, well, I was in undergrad genetics way more than 20 years ago, but we would have never been asked to do like a family tree as an exercise in genetics. It was, it would be about our flies in the lab, our populations, whereas these students are starting from the reconstruction of their family tree, describing their genealogical ancestors. And the graph at the right is an illustration for the students of how your number of genealogical ancestors will sort of increase exponential. That is, at least for a time before it starts to flatten out, because you share genealogical ancestors and then start to dip, because we actually originate from a relative small number for people alive today. And similarly, then with your genetic ancestors will be more linear until they also flatten out as well, but they're far fewer than your genealogical ancestors. Now, so I'm trying to wrap my head around a little bit what I think is a change over time in population genetics and genomics. We sort of went from, populations as the starting point, statistical differences, to maybe more with genomics, a segmented genome, not single alleles, but, physical bits of the genome as haplotypes, for example, being inherited, to now looking at segments as being ancestrally marked some way, conveyed to you by particular of your ancestors who live somewhere. So that geography is sort of embedded in our genomes. And how do you sort of understand this? I just thought one way of starting was to think of Jim Griesemer's work on reproducers and material overlap, which he worked on to try to challenge the more informational or copying ideas of replicators, and so that we could understand heredity and development together. And I think that's a good way to start. Okay, well, if we're going to look at our, situate ourselves in terms of our genealogical ancestors and our genetic ancestors, we can look at that in this material, physical way. We know that, we're each a product of a haploid sperm and egg getting together, that starts. So we have that material overlap from one generation to the next. And then we, with cell division, that material overlap continues, and DNA replication is semi-conservative. So there's material overlap in some sense. So if we want to take this, look at it from this approach of genealogical ancestors and genetic ancestors being central to this approach to population genetics and genomics, that's the starting point. I happened to dabble a little bit in genealogy, so I just thought, well, I would have done very well on this assignment that the second year genetics class had to do. Now, when you're doing genealogy, sort of this idea that your genealogical ancestors are your biological ancestors is not necessarily the case. I mean, that's a choice about what your interests are and what your family tree looks like. So, for example, if I reconstruct my family tree, then there's my great-grandfather was adopted. I don't know who his biological parents were. It's interesting. I mean, obviously, we're formed by our society, our family upbringing, probably more than our biological parentage. There's no reason why you wouldn't carve out, your genealogy in terms of social and not just biological ancestors, and be interested maybe that, yeah, he, came from, loyalists who came from New Jersey or whatever to Upper Canada, blah, blah, blah. So there's already an assumption, right? That your genealogical ancestors are biological ancestors. Now that makes, sense in the framework of population genetics and genomics, perhaps, but it's a narrow, it's still interest relative, narrowing, right? And similar when we start to look at, like Helen Macbeth said, mating relations are social relations. They're, we humans tend to marry often, and our marriage rituals and rules are prescribed by the society and the culture in which we live in. And if we want to look in a wider sense about heredity, we inherit a lot more than, our cytoplasm from our mothers, and our DNA from both. If you want to look at, I talked about material overlap, if you want to look at the intergenerational transfer, whether it's by reproduction or it's by persistence, and when you're doing genealogy, so I mentioned, an adopted great-grandparent, great-grandfather. Well, he certainly, inherited the strict Methodism that he imposed on my grandmother, much unhappily, from off to the right, his family line that were the first who donated property to for the first Methodist church in the area, and cemetery that was transmitted intergenerationally as well. So these are just examples of, trace a surname across generations. That also follows genealogical, reproductive sorts of relations, marital records, wills, property deeds, censuses. The imperial colonial world, the European colonial imperial world that has shaped the world we live in today, with its strange coronation rituals handed down intergenerationally, the privilege handed down to the next generation, the jewels stolen from colonized, plundered from colonized places in the world, also transmitted. So there's a lot more that's transmitted intergenerational that includes material overlap than just our DNA. And the reason I'm making that point, which is of course a very basic point, is because a lot of the research that's been going on, that I'll finish with a few examples in the talk, is actually very recent, relative. It's not distant evolutionary history. It's actually relatively recent. So it's an important question, the extent to which, genes are authoritative, right, in terms of reconstructing those histories. Okay, so, and I think when we think of genealogy and genetics coming so close to one another these days, part of the craze about doing genealogy, the big companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, their relationships with population geneticists, those who serve on their board, those who work with them, that a lot of the research in population genetics is complementary to people, spitting in the tube and sending it away to get information on things like their ancestry. It's important to look at that context as well. So, some of the odds are the BBC genealogy show, who do you think you are? Ancestry, discover what makes you uniquely you. And this isn't about DNA right now, it's about traditional genealogy. Family search, the Mormon site, find your family, discover yourself, learn where you came from, and get to know who you are. Learn where you came from and get to know who you are. Of course, Ancestry is going to try to sell extra DNA testing kits when it comes time, St. Patrick's Day comes along, but also governmental tourist agencies are getting into it. Come to Ireland, learn about your past. I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that it's all about you, okay, an individual, and somehow ancestors become ancestry. So if you look at my own ancestral background, you'll find Highland Scot and Lowland Scot. You'll find English. Apparently, all my ancestors came to Canada by the mid-1850s, which I didn't know until I delved into this. Protestant Irish, whether from Tyrone or Tipperary, French Canadian fur traders, Ojibwe, Miami. So, a whole mash of people who have made up Canada and contributed to the Canada I live in today. But I don't know what it is to say. I can say I have loyalist ancestors. I have ancestors from the Scottish Highlands who settled in Nova Scotia and then Ontario. I have Protestant Irish ancestors who came from Tipperary or Tyrone. But what does it mean I have Ojibwe ancestors, but what does it mean? I have French Canadian ancestors, but what does it mean to say that I have ancestry? If I'm going to say, if I'm going to even find out what my ancestors are in terms of ethnicity or nationality, I need to travel back in time. I have to know what the ethnicities and nationalities and the religious possibilities were there and how they related to other people who they lived among, and what the conventions were for intermarriage, for what, I have to know a lot about that time just to say, that particular ancestor of mine who lived in the 1700s, right, was this or was that, you have to do a lot of work, but what does it mean then to say, I am French Canadian, I'm Ojibwe, I am Protestant from Tipperary? Like, no, so we really need to think about how ancestors collapse into ancestry and become something that an individual can even possess, right? And that's true, for example, in Canada. And I think this is it's really interesting to talk to people from different places, because what it means to be a mestizo or métis is different in, say, Mexico than in Canada. What it means to be indigenous. So, in Canada right now, it's a bit of the rage to have indigenous ancestry. Even the Library and Archives Canada, says we'll help you find out if you have indigenous ancestry. Similar in the US, this sort of use DNA testing to uncover your Native American ancestor. Genealogical service will see if we can find you an indigenous ancestor in your family tree. But, finding an indigenous ancestor doesn't give anybody, indigenous, what is it to say you have indigenous ancestry, other than if that just means you have an indigenous ancestor, but then what does it say about you? I mean, to be in Canada, First Nations have their own ways of determining who's a citizen and who's not. We have a real problem with people claiming indigenous ancestry, whether that because they have some distant ancestry they've discovered through genealogical research, or because they've had family stories about that, or because they've just made it up. There's a series right now on Canada Land, a podcast series that it's actually happening weekly now, and last week was about coming into prison, and just you can just say you're indigenous, and you'll get certain privileges that might make prison life a little bit easier, and there's no validating that. You can just tick a box. And so it's not unusual to find apparently pretend Indians in prison. And but these sorts of claims that people are pursuing and trying to use DNA testing and genealogical research to establish is very ethically, politically fraught, given the history of violence and genocide by Europeans in Canada against our indigenous people who were here. So when someone like me, who has a little bit of something in their family tree, then comes to claim it, given the efforts in Canada right now to work on truth and reconciliation because of the harms that have been done, it seems to just alleviate responsibility that, most of my family tree contains people who actually got land grants for free or little money when they arrived in Canada. But it's this sort of thing that I'm trying to, think about, is how the ancestors become ancestry and become something about an individual, something embodied in them. And this is what the genetic ancestry includes, encourages us to do, right? We have segments of our genomes that come from certain of our ancestors who had a certain ethnicity and, lived in certain places, and DNA tests will help us, discover our ethnicity or find out where we really came from. And, it encourages that sort of embedding of an ancestry, in an individual that seems quite suspect. And you can see so you've got ways of, following, for example, mitochondrial DNA through quite so-called deep ancestry to quite ancient migrations, but the ancestry.com DNA ancestry, encouraging you to sort of collapse those generations, start with you, go to your mom, and then go all the way back to Africa, just like that. So that's just an example again of how ancestors become collapsed in ancestry and history becomes, flattened. So this is 23andMe, just, how do they end up assigning ancestry to the genome then? 23andMe's reference populations are based on individuals carefully chosen to reflect populations that existed before transcontinental travel and migration were common at least 500 years ago. So they will include in a reference population for one of the major regions of the world, 4 grandparents born in the same country but not a colonial nation. So again, that still sounds a lot like race, and that being considered then an important part of how we understand ourselves, genealogically speaking. Now, there hasn't been a lot of critical work on ancestry, but these articles written by the same group, Anna Lewis Munley researcher is an exception to that. These articles themselves call for more of a critique of the concept of ancestry, and I think really important for all of us at the bottom is that the overrepresent, especially those of us who live outside the U.S., the overrepresentation of the U.S. in normative literature on this topic. So much is about race and OMB categories in terms of the literature because of the sort of the power of the U.S. in the academic, scientific lay of the land. So the authors here emphasize that when we talk about genetic ancestry, it doesn't require categorization by population or group, right? Or contextualization in terms of geography and culture, because it simply is about stretches of the genome that you have inherited from particular ancestors. So if you go back to my family tree, you could just go, okay, there's that little bit of DNA and it came from here and then here and then here and then here and then here. And where those people lived, or what they considered themselves to be, or what we might today consider themselves to be, doesn't matter. And yet categories are almost always imposed, and often, and they're critical about this as others have been, as the 23andMe example showed, often to the continents. They urge that concepts and tools be developed that recognize a more complex notion of ancestry, that how the categories are drawn depend at what historical depth you're going, and that ancestry is continuous. Now, don't know if it's possible to talk about ancestry in a way that then doesn't have access to situating it in terms of some of these categories. for the particular purposes that that population geneticists and genomics are working. So so this is sort of I would say something that I've been saying for a long time in my own work, is that we need to be pragmatists. Local pragmatist epistemology is important when we're talking about group categories in genetics and genomics. And these are group categories beyond just race, but include lots of other social group categories that end up getting used, and that really there's no escaping the social, the political background of the categories that get used. So, you know, it goes against everything they believe, but population geneticists and genomicists should realize they're working actually with, they're taking a biological approach, but they're working with social groups or socially constructed groups. And so I want to see this report as sort of an opportunity, because in many ways, although I criticize a few things about it, you can appreciate it's quite a radical report in terms of the kinds of recommendations that it makes. And there were a number of non-biologists on this committee. Sandra Susan Lee is an anthropologist, Anne Morning, historian, Dorothy Roberts, sociologist, and so forth. But there's a lot of scientists, of population geneticists, epidemiologists, and it is really quite something for all of them to come together and make what I think is in many ways quite a radical report. I don't have a lot left, but if just some of the work I've done in the past is just to defend a pragmatic epistemology for human population genetics and genomics, to argue that populations are constructed, they're made, that it's preferable to think, if you're going to approach it sort of with a logical framework, it's better to think of populations or groups used in population genetics and genomics being just collections, sets. You're grouping individuals based on particular properties that you think are relevant to the particular question that you're asking, rather than assuming that there's these well-bounded entities called populations, like the species as individuals, populations as individuals, and these individuals are more or less well-bounded, and they endure, they persist through time as sort of intact lineages. As Helen Macbeth's quote said, that's why isolates have been preferred for population genetics and genomics research, because generally populations just don't look like that. That I think we can't avoid categories that are social in doing a lot of this research, because even I would say for this attempt to go to genetic ancestry, there is no wholly biologic, wholly genetic level in which we can talk about, in which we can access to do population genetics and genomics. We know a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I don't believe in race. We shouldn't use race to do population genetics and genomics, but there is population structure. Yes, it's true that alleles aren't, evenly distributed across space and across time. But even saying there's population structure assumes, right, that there are well-bounded populations that persist through time, which is a problematic assumption. So, just to be able to capture, the differences in gene frequencies and haplotype frequencies across space and time, we do need to draw boundaries, and we shouldn't be surprised when those boundaries, if they coincide with geographic distance or some kind of social distance, that we see average differences. But that makes them no less of a social group. And there's to a large degree, I would say that this report actually, coincides with some of the more sociological, anthropological, humanistic critiques of population genetics and genomics researchers and saying, in this pragmatist framework, and asking researchers, for example, to justify their criteria for selecting subjects and composing and labeling groups, that it's not just about labels, it's just not about what you call people. You're making fundamental conceptual decisions, and those fundamental conceptual decisions need to be made rigorously, in view of the purposes of the research. And surely we will do better research if we choose our categories, our concepts well. So because research, this is from the report, because research conducted using genomics data is broad and varied, the committee concluded that there's no one size fits all to the challenge of using population descriptors. Rather, the appropriate population descriptor depends on the scientific question that is being asked. So very much a pragmatic epistemological framework that I think is really helpful in asking scientists to interrogate their categories and not just, assume that, the ways we happen to divide up people, what we take for granted, are the best categories for the particular purposes of that particular study or a research program. This is just a comment. I thought there might be a lesson a little bit in what was a sort of short-lived effort by the Human Genome Research Institute in the States to develop this DNA polymorphism discovery resource. This was in about 1997, 98. And it was when a lot of the pharmaceutical companies were doing a lot of SNP research, trying to isolate SNPs that might be useful in discovering disease genes and bringing about treatments. And the publicly funded Human Genome Project didn't want SNP discovery to be locked up by the private sector, so decided to create this resource that included European American, African American, Mexican American, and Native American, Asian American people who identified in those ways, but the particular samples from individuals were not labeled racially, ethnically. So what you had then was a grouping of samples that did reflect to some extent the diversity of American people who, might benefit from, SNP identification and disease gene discovery and such. But there was no, the idea was you would have enough variation among your samples to discover variable sites of the genome, these single nucleotide polymorphisms that might then be helpful in research. Now, it was in part, it was sort of a race to make sure, SNP stayed in the public domain. So it was a bit of a shortcut. And by that time, they were recognizing that they had to figure out the race issue. So it was a bit of a shortcut. And the result was that, as Sandra Sujin Lee points out, that it was criticized as by researchers as giving an incomplete picture, making the collection even useless, being a politically correct denial of race, and the collection was underused. But pragmatically, what is wrong with, getting a whole collection of genetic samples that are representative of the variation that is in the population that, as say the National Institutes of Health, you have a responsibility towards, and using those to generate knowledge of these variable sites in the genome that might be helpful to research. It seems like, a perfectly acceptable way to go about fulfilling the purpose of this research, which did not need, right, the individual samples to be labeled as such. But what I think it shows is a resistance of scientists maybe to be without those labels, that they understand them, even though for the specific purposes of this research, they felt it was a waste of a resource not to have that information available. The other thing was just I don't know if I managed to articulate it very well, but I think there's if you just think of it, if you're going to try to say that genetic ancestry, doesn't depend on our social, our political, our cultural categories, how you really can't make use of genetic ancestry across time and place. All you have is, you share a segment, these individuals share a segment of their genome with these other individuals, and there's no place, there's no time. It really makes it quite impossible to do research into migrations or drift or whatever have you. So, I don't see that there's an escape from having groupings that do depend on some of our social classifications, and that's why I'm using the term socially constructed populations. As I said before, I argue that populations aren't these well-bounded biological objects. They get bounded by researchers, and they get bounded in different ways. The Dobzhansky looking forward, this kind of ancestry looking past, they get bounded in different ways depending on different interests. So they're constructed, scientific objects for sure. And I to call them socially constructed objects, makes me a little bit uneasy, just for the reason that I've tried to undercut and challenge the sort of dichotomization of the social and the biological, to make sure that in a research environment you can combine social and political relations and not see them as some ontically distinct realm. So I'm a little bit uneasy about the term socially constructed, and I'm wrestling with that a little bit. And it why not just constructed? Somebody asked me, like, as you sort of done in the past. And I guess there's some reasons that I'd love some comments on this. Is well, all this stuff based on genealogy and ancestry. I mean, these ideas of kin and ancestral relationships vary culturally as reproductive relations patterns, genealogical ties. These are all social and cultural, not just biological. And I would say they're more fundamentally social and cultural, right? It's as I've said, this sort of recourse to shared genetic ancestry is only meaningful in an evolutionary context given genetic variation across space and time, and only ascertainable then with the imposition of geographical and temporal boundaries. There's no population genetic structure otherwise. That therefore, when geneticists construct populations through their methodologies, they're using categories based on geography, race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, language, and so forth. These are all social, political, historical categories. They may or may not have causal relevance for the distribution of genetic variants across time, but you can't fix your genealogical ancestors to place in time. You can't fix the genes they carry to place in time without them. There's no outside to theories, technologies, commerce that make up the research context. There's no outside to structural racism, historical injustices, global inequalities, the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. When choices are being made and categories are being justified, and the direction of research is being justified, those choices need to be made from within and not without. And human evolution history is human history, which you'll see with my last just few examples of some of the research that's going on. It's about us and others, and the research findings are going to matter to people socially, politically, ethically, psychologically. I'm going to skip that. These are just some examples of, I think, how you see sort of genealogy and genetics come together. And this is called an ancient DNA analysis. What it's of is there was a furnace in Maryland that operated from 1776 to 1903 and up to 1850 with the labor of enslaved people. And there was a cemetery where there's people buried that got disturbed for, some construction project. And there was an effort by a historical society that, reconstructed the furnace to work with the geneticists to try to identify in some way the remains of the mix of free and enslaved African Americans in that burial site. And as it turned out, the cooperation with 23andMe was then also able to identify descendants of some of those people as well. Now, the research involved seeing if they were related, family members. It looked at their ancestry in terms of European, how much European ancestry they had, and then, as I said, it traced their descendants. So it tried to give them some idea of who they were, what background they had. Now it's interesting, David Reich's done a lot of ancient DNA research, and this was also funded by the NIH, was involved in this project, and he's someone who, says is very objectivist about the likelihood that there are going to be genetic differences between racial groups that have been long separated, but here he's involved in a project that has aims that are are more conducive, I guess, to more emancipatory aims. But I thought it was interesting to see what he talks about in his ancient DNA research. There's little solace for racist or nationalistic misinterpretation. The pursuit of truth for its own sake has overwhelmingly the effect of. I just wanted to focus on the pursuit of truth for its own sake. I mean, this is an example of research that is not the pursuit of truth for its own sake. I mean, there's a fact of the matter whether, someone's a descendant of someone who was in that burial site, but you can't say that we're just discovering nature here. This project is meaningful to people in quite socio, historically, political, ethical ways. Similar, and you might say, well, that's just because it's recent. These are, this was it's hardly ancient. It was 170 years ago. If this is another ancient DNA analysis, it goes back 6,200 years. It looks at, it's very similar, very uncovered bodies, attempt to identify their family relationships, attempt to identify, their ancestry, like where they had come from. The findings being that they were not closely related, so it was not some kind of interfamilial thing. They were also didn't show a lot of signs of a recent group coming from elsewhere. And the conclusions sort of like, we humans have been massacring each other for a long time. It's hardly not meaningful, in a wider sense of. So my last example is just something closer to home, just to emphasize that where you live really changes what research is done, and this one is not at all about racial differences like a lot of the emphasis in the US. This is population genetic structure paper about Newfoundland and Labrador that looks at populations who lived in the outports, so isolated villages that didn't have road access, that were accessible only by boat, where they found that by genealogical records as well, that people had immigrated from Catholics from the from Southeast Ireland and Protestants from, I think, Southwest England, I believe, and that because of the long period of isolation and the very localized areas in which people immigrated from, you definitely see population genetic structure, and that it's a good resource because of the homogeneity and the isolation in the discovery of fairly rare Mendelian disorders. But the questions that get asked depend on where we are and what we're trying to come up with recommendations. They can't all be about race. We need to be very much look at other kinds of group categories that get used in population genetics and genomics. And in this case, these are almost familial groups as well. There you had four grandparents who came from, you see in this map, from particular areas of Newfoundland. And, you know, there weren't roads, a lot of those, there weren't roads to communities until after Newfoundland entered Confederation, which was after the Second World War. So long periods of isolation, but also, you know, where sort of a family group becomes a population, you know, an extended family group as a population group. There's some concerns also then about privacy. Anyway, so just to close off, as the report says, there's been, despite many efforts, there's been very little change in the confusing and damaging uses of race, ethnicity, and ancestry as population descriptors. Scientists continue to debate whether race is a useful proxy, often fueled by deeply embedded, often unexamined biological concepts of race. Scientists are part of a research enterprise whose members, journal editors, funders, research institutions have failed to effectively coordinate their efforts. Success requires a collective will to confront and resolve the inevitable challenges. This report, as I said, is quite radical in many ways, and I guess I pushed it even a little bit further, I hope. But it recognizes that it's even though this is coming from the top levels of U.S. NIH, it's an uphill process. Thanks, that's it.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It was a really in-depth analysis of what this report, these recommendations from the NASEM grouping would entail or would mean for these long-term discussions, interdisciplinary discussions in which you have participated in this very interesting way. So I want to start the next part of our session, which is the dialogue with you. Reading from the abstract that you kindly shared with us some days ago, that corresponds to the presentation that you will be giving at the PSA meeting, the upcoming meeting of the Philosophy of Science Association. You say there that by abandoning debates about race and genetics that founder on unproductive dichotomies opposing what is biologically real, scientifically objective, and what is socially constructed, politically ideological, philosophers of science might seek instead to convince scientists that they can get on with doing genetics and genomics, even once they accept these conclusions from the humanities and social sciences. So I think that in a way, many of the points that you have made today correspond to this main idea in the research work that you are working on. But I would say that during your presentation, the issue of yourself identifying this pragmatist commitment or view that the NASEM report has, which corresponds to something that you have been pursuing for many years, is also something that should be highlighted. So one first question, if I may already start with this part of the session, would be posed in the following way. How interesting, no, that you see this convergence. Why do you think this is happening now? I mean, is there a reason that's related to an influence, a growing influence that work such as yours is having on that community, or are there other reasons that are probably related to the dynamic, the sociological dynamics of those communities of research scientists, which are now, as we all know, facing the new challenges that academics all over the world are facing regarding, new ways in which society at large is protesting in relation to racism, gender issues, and many other contexts that are now public everywhere, and we're every day faced with them, no? So that would be a first question. A second thing that I want to say is considering that this very interesting talk also in a way was you gave us a tour of your own trajectory, no? More or less at the second part of the talk, referring to previous work that you have been doing about these topics. Could you tell us a bit more about how you see your own philosophical work evolving or transforming itself into probably something more interdisciplinary, or instead, because of what we were saying before, so the new challenges, societal challenges, are pushing the research communities into being more self-critical. Is this something that is also participating in the new views that you are having related? This probably sometimes we could describe them as opportunities for cooperation, even, no? Because there were parts in your talk when you say that this is a new opportunity. So I want to go deeper into what kind of opportunity, or opportunity for what is this convergence that we were talking about before. Those would be the first two questions that I would have, no? And many thanks for this very, very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And we have more questions coming, probably from the public, and I definitely have more, smaller sized questions later.
I think part of it is, the Human Genome Project did provide a lot of funding for ELSI research. And a lot of that ELSI research has been done by sociologists and anthropologists. And a lot has been on, there's been a number of people who have been working, for like 2 decades, right? Problematizing group categories in genetics, as part of ELSI funding to do with the coming out of the Human Genome Project. But then there's been in the US a lot of other work that's been done because of the use of the OMB categories, mandated by the NIH since 1993, that the census categories that were developed for to monitor civil rights gains needed to be, so for social and political purposes, needed to be used in pharmacogenetics and in any NIH funded research. So I think that's one of the things that helped, that's moved it towards sort of this greater awareness of the problematic nature is the mandating of those categories, for scientists to grapple with them. Right. So there's been a lot of debate, among scientists who disagree, over the utility of, say, racial classification in various kinds of medical, often medical research. There's also been this, a lot of it more empirical ELSI kind of research over that problematizes the concepts. So, I think there's just been lots of activity in lots of areas, and I think a lot of scientists also are, influenced by anti-racism, anti-colonialism, attention to those issues, and are reflecting on their own work as well. Right. I think there's been a shock at, among some scientists at the uptake of their work by, say, white supremacists in the United States. So interdisciplinarity, for me, I think I always was interested in group categories and never so much in race per se. When I entered into doing this work on population genetics, it was about, when I started looking at race as not having disappeared, like, population genetics was supposed to have made it disappear. When I worked on Dobzhansky as part of my PhD dissertation, it was like, what do you mean? Population geneticists told us there's no race, there's race all the way through his work. But then as I looked further, then population seemed to become, the concept that was problematic, because at least for Dobzhansky, it anchored his ideas about race, that races just were genetically distinct populations. So when philosophy got all towards like social construction versus biological reality and that, like, I tried to contribute by kind of subverting the dichotomy, but that debate didn't really appeal to me, and then I kind of drew back from it all. I was getting invited like to come and to be on conference panels, for example, with philosophers who were debating the biological reality of race or not, and it wasn't really something that interested me. I was always just more interested in group categories and genetics, I guess. And a lot of the people whose work I have really enjoyed reading have been the more historians, sociologists, anthropologists who have worked more broadly, like folks at UNAM on mestizo genomic stuff Catherine Nash's work on Ireland, and these are sort of the works that I think I have enjoyed, engaging with the most, and so yeah, although yes, I go to Philosophy of Science conference because I think this one is a great panel on ancestry, which is really important. Yeah, I see the people maybe who I don't get the opportunity so much to interact with, but I interact with them through what I read, maybe more.
Right. So it is then possible that this particular session that you will be in will make a difference in terms of the participation that philosophers of science can have in the debate. No, even though, as you were saying before, there have been these steps forward. No, we could probably characterize them objectively. No, forward to what? Well, to critical scientific research. No, at the very least. So that itself is very interesting. And as you were mentioning briefly, we had our own chapter of critical analysis from an interdisciplinary perspective here in Mexico. That had a peak some years ago, and lately the discussion has not been so numerous as before. But still, we are, as this group attests, and our meetings are a sample of. We're still very interested in this debate from Mexico, especially in a comparative perspective. So there was another question that I had, Lisa, which comes to insist on a point that you were making before about your reluctance to get into the debates that many philosophers of science and philosophers of biology in particular were having, no? About the social versus biological construction or notions of race as a debate that was probably too narrow-minded or too rigid, and that you were trying to kind of do something different, no? And your work definitely is a test to that. So in that regard, I remember since and this is something that I didn't mention when I presented you, but you have been a long-term member of the International Society for the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology, which is actually where we, I think, met many years ago. So we both remember that debates on species concepts and the species problem, right, which were also kind of being, if I may use the word, influenced probably too much by the way in which the communities of biologists were thinking in these very, rigid terms about taxonomy and typology versus population and process-based aspects. Do you think that at some point those types of debates in the philosophy of biology kind of also contaminated, if I may use that word, the way in which philosophers of science interested in race or classificatory practices were doing their own work? Is there a chance that probably that main tradition of work on species concepts and the species problem interacted in a negative way? Let's put it that way. Probably a better way to put it instead of using words like contamination. Another thing that I want to tell you is that this question that you are posing about when does ancestors become ancestors, I think is a very, very clever way of putting the attention on what's very, very important here, which is the practices of reification, that go on in this scientific research. I don't think that this is a topic in which too much collective understanding has been achieved. I know many authors, you are one of them, who see this clearly, but this is certainly a topic in which I don't think that at the community level people are so much aware of. And I would like to ask you if you have any ideas of why this should be so, or why it would be important to advance on that topic. I will stop there and listen to your responses and then come up with a new set of questions.
Yeah, I think we're all constrained by our own disciplines when we try to do something that isn't, well prescribed within the contours of our disciplines. I think we first met at the Ishkabibble meetings, and I know as a student when I first went there, it felt so freeing to go to a talk where it was a biologist talking, but you wouldn't have known it. They were historical, they were philosophical. And so some of the talks, not always, some are clearly historical or clearly philosophical, but there would be talks where, that it was clearly a person. I mean, I think of Evelyn Fox Keller's work when I first went to Ish, or Diane Paul's, that were well situated within the science, but pulled out, that the aspects of historical interest, of philosophical interest, of what matters socially, of what matters politically. Their approach itself was interdisciplinary, not just bringing different people together. And right. For me, that was why it was, a place that I enjoyed, being as a conference. Whereas often in philosophy, we get imprisoned by, the metaphysical questions, which is going to always be, is it real or it's not real? Or the species problem, So, and I mean, you need to engage with people around you, but I often found in philosophy that there were problems that I wasn't that interested in. And to the extent I tried to fit my work, to the species problem or whatever, sometimes I think my work wasn't as good as it might have been had I just kind of dabbled, freely. Like my partner is a journalist, and sometimes I think I just, being a journalistic philosopher might be a good thing, just pull on what you need from where you can get it in order to say something that you think is important to say philosophically, but maybe small p philosophically, about the scientific area or problem space that you're interested in, like find what's interesting in the science and then draw the resources to deal with it, from there, whether than getting locked into a disciplinary perspective. I think my better work is where I've just, well, I don't even know that I've managed to do maybe what I should have, and just letting myself be more of a more journalistic, more of a dabbler, I guess. And I think once you've defended a pragmatist position, you know, that it's the purpose of the research, it's the context, it's what it's for, is what matters. Then there's not a lot to say, you know, to a broader debate on, you know, the metaphysics of race. You know, you just keep saying no, you know, and that gets boring. So that's why I kind of absented from that. But I find the ancestry thing interesting because it's technically interesting. The science is interesting, and it is combining with genealogy in ways that, you know, are interesting as well.
As you showed in this part of your talk, that I found it very surprising and at the same time quite interesting that you actually have been, I don't know how recently, been looking into your own genealogy in order to take that as an example for thinking through concepts and positions in philosophy, right? So that's a part of the talk that I think it's great, and I should go back to fully understand what it means, no? Because everybody, each one of us could do the same, no? This is one of the special aspects of this research, no? That definitely it calls upon your own understanding of your personal history and the history of your family and people you know, no? So in that regard, it really calls for a deeply interdisciplinary perspective, no? No single or mono specific academic or intellectual perspective is ever going to be enough, no? For things like this, no? For topics such as this. Yeah. So, Jimena, do you want to intervene at this point? I still have a few more questions in my hands, but probably it's important that we take some of the questions from the public or from you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have some notes, but not very concrete question at this moment. Just thank you very much, Lisa, because you put such interesting and very deep questions on the table. So I'm still thinking about this. I don't know if someone in the Zoom session wants to comment or ask anything. As we told you, you can intervene verbally or you can write on the chat, and you can do it in English or in Spanish, and we will make an effort to translate. So let us know if any one of you have something to say or ask or.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the issues, you know, about group categories in genetics and genomics, they're local, they're national, they're, you know, they're, you know, these need to be local epistemologies, right? Not just pragmatic, but local. So I would be really interested in learning from people who live elsewhere than I do, how these things come together in your own experience too.
Definitely, your mention of the issue of mestizaje and the mestizo category in Mexico is very important. Everybody knows about it. Everybody's aware of the trickiness of the concept in our own context. And I really appreciate that you draw this comparison between the métis category in Canada with what we call mestizo, no? Which is something for us to continue thinking about. So while we have some contributions from the audience or from the people who are joining us live, I wanted to ask you two things that might seem to be very different, but actually come together, I think, in the bottom. They have to do with what is this philosophy of science, of these particular sciences that we're talking about? No, I have been mentioning the term interdisciplinary, which was definitely exemplified during the whole presentation. So as you know, this cycle of conversations tries to bring always to the table the issue of biological, before physical anthropology, no? Which, as we know, has had many different national traditions, no? Talking about local issues, as you were saying before. So, given your own experience of many years with these cases that you were describing today, and the many conclusions that you have arrived before and now, so you have been doing mostly a philosophy of science or biology concentrated on what population genomics or population genomicists before population geneticists did or do with the data that they produce, no? With the knowledge production that they are engaged in. So many times issues related to anthropology interact with that domain of things that are going on in the world, no? Analyzed from this meta-scientific perspective. If I were to ask you, what is, as a philosopher of science, what do you think is or could be a philosophy of biological anthropology? What would be your response to that? Is it actually possible to, you know, separate that so neatly, or again would be moving in this realm of things that are interacting in and out all the time, but still, even under those circumstances, what could you say could be thought of as a philosophy of biological anthropology? And the other question, the second question that I mentioned, could be considered completely different, but it's actually connected in, I think, interesting ways, is what is forensics to you? No? I mean, many of the practices, of the scientific practices that you have been analyzing over the years are clearly, because of methodological issues, especially, and technical issues, closely connected to what many people, for instance, in medicine would recognize as forensics, but actually also in anthropology, both in archaeology and in physical biological anthropology. And since you mentioned ancient DNA projects as part of the domain of a particular research project that you're analyzing, what do you have to say about what forensics means in the context of all your philosophical project about all of these interesting issues?
Forensics being like directly connected to like law enforcement, that kind of forensics?
Obviously, that's very interesting that you put it that way, because, for instance, in Mexico, as I think in the US,
yeah,
forensics, when it is related to genomics or to the analysis of DNA sequencing, then analyzed via bioinformatic programs and so on and so forth, is many times connected to things that have to do with crime pursuit or I mean, the law, no? Let's put it that way, very simply. However, many times forensic anthropologists have to, for instance, come in or medical people from the medical profession that have been trained in forensics, no, as it used to be. So my question was, what does that realm of scientific practices have to do with the work that you are looking at? And in that sense, how do you see it as a practice that might have even more than other subdisciplines, a lot of pragmatism involved in how they do their own work?
Yeah. Well, I think generally, I mean, people working in genetics, genomics, you know, it's hard to say anybody's like pursuing truth for, you know, for its own sake. You know, there's a practical context, you know, for, you know, pretty much everything. Pretty much most that goes on, right, in these fields, and you know, the practical context is, you know, more proximate or closer, you know, for some fields than others. Like, for example, you know, forensic, you know, anthropology, whether it's law identification of remains, or, and I have looked at in the past a little bit into the, you know, the racial identification of remains, because of course that was very interesting, you know, vis-a-vis, you know, population differences and typological population thinking and that sort of thing. I never did that much with it, but, you know, for a time I was reading it, and I should go back to some of that, because you know, some of the the same assumptions, must be getting made as I have been looking at more in the genetic genealogy and the more population genetic fields in terms of that kind of, the racial identification of remains or something like that. And I think that's really an interesting and an important area that I have looked at, like 10, 15, 10, maybe 20 years ago, but haven't gone back to lately. But there's, a lot to look at there for sure. A philosophy of biological anthropology. I don't even have much of a philosophy of biology or a philosophy of anything, I don't think. But I think that there's so much interdisciplinary work that is going on now, so a lot of these projects are have people who are, what's the, where's the line between, population genetics, anthropological genetics, I mean, it's not clear. I mean, I looked at Mark Schreiber's work, for example, when I was looking at biogeographical ancestry, and he's a biological anthropologist, using population genetic, techniques and having that training. So there's not, really much of a line between, people in those fields that are working with genetics specifically, and a lot of times they are working cooperatively on research projects. And I think the more empirically inclined folks in science studies, I think there must be really interesting things to see in terms of those interdisciplinary teams and how they work together, how those, some slight differences in training, whether you're a biological anthropologist or a human population geneticist, what are the fine differences there, and how do they come out when you're thrown together working on the same problem, or are they getting more negligible? And I have no idea. But I think it's interesting.
To pose a question, no? Because for instance, now that we are referring to authors that we have read or known. For instance, I remember that not many years ago, in the community of philosophers of science oriented towards the natural or the life sciences, we had Turner, right? A philosopher of biology from the US, writing books about the philosophy of paleontology.
Yeah. Derek Turner. Yeah.
Exactly, Derek Turner. Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So I kind of asked myself, no, okay, so if for a subject which is, fossils, which in a way is related to some of the issues that we have been talking about, it's just that here we are restricting ourselves to, the past of the human species or the human, phylogenetic vicinity, so hominids and primates, no? But still, it's very similar in terms of conceptualization. What Derek Turner was doing for paleontology might be done for paleoanthropology or, as I said, biological anthropology. So I think it's really a challenge for philosophy of science itself to deal with these disciplines which are so thoroughly interdisciplinary. No? Still, what things could we say, as specialists in philosophy, in branches of philosophy of science, for even scientists to, be aware of the conceptual problems and the issues that could be said about philosophical position, but also political. I have to say sometimes that our special discussion might illuminate them into what are they doing and how they could even do their science in a way that solves some of the problems that they have. No, so we're not imposing problems on them, but we're identifying problems that they have or problematizing their practice. No, and that interaction, which is again also another type of interdisciplinarity, could be useful and could help us advance, as academic researchers in general into learning more and actually addressing these problems. Some of them very important for everybody, as in this particular cases we've evidently seen. No, and so the issue of philosophy of paleontology is something that has been in my head for a number of years since I started to read Turner. So I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you about it. So something that I also was very interesting for me during your presentation is that in this in-depth analysis that you made, and thank you very much again for that, of the NASEM report, the committee report, you went through the list of, the people who are in some sort of council that prepared this document. And I noticed that a person from Mexico, Andrés Moreno Estrada, is part of this list of contributors. So Andrés Moreno Estrada is an interesting population genomicist that works in Mexico, although he was educated, I think, in abroad, and worked, as far as I know, at least in Stanford, in the United States, in some indirect or direct relation with Luigi Cavalli Sforza, I think. And that tells something already, which is interesting in the trajectory of a population genomicist. And he has been, being part and sometimes the leader of many population genomics projects that have to do with Mexico. So one of the most recent ones, which was actually highly publicized recently in many news venues and even in publications at UNAM, when some of the papers were published in Nature, if I remember correctly, about the so-called Mexican Biobank. So when I went to read these papers, not so long ago, a few months ago, actually to prepare a talk that I was invited to give about what's going on with population genomics in Mexico from our perspective, this meta-scientific perspective that we share, I noticed, to my surprise, that in one of the papers, he and his group and another group of colleagues who published back-to-back in Nature were looking at neighborhoods in Mexico City. So neighborhoods such as Coyoacán, which is actually very close to where we are now. And the other places that they were looking at in this very, very focused way were located in a region of Mexico City that's called Iztapalapa. So for everybody who lives in Mexico City, talking about Coyoacán and Iztapalapa immediately draws the comparison between a culture-rich place, and I'm probably being a bit oversimplifying here, but definitely many people here will get the idea, versus a poor and underdeveloped or challenged socially place, which is Iztapalapa, a place where there is a lot of criminality and there are many bad stereotypes about people who live there or who were born there. So what could you tell us, knowing about this particular feature of these studies that is relevant for doing better population genomic science, given the analysis that you have been making of these many different cases in Canada and in other places in the global north, and in some cases also elsewhere in the world? What, as a philosopher of science, so interested in these topics that have to do with human systems of classification, what could you tell us about these particular projects that are going on in Mexico? And also, I have to say, because this is a topic that we haven't touched upon a lot, but it's definitely something that we could not overlook. Financing for these projects come from the UK, and not necessarily from Mexico. So the issue of who is giving the money for these projects to continue going on is also something that makes part of the domain of things that we have to continue analyzing.
Yeah, I think sort of the beauty of being a pragmatist, or having looking at things with a local pragmatist, epistemological framework, is that the purposes of why you're doing the research really matter. And the contributions that research may make matter too. Is it going to make a positive contribution to society, to the people who are being studied, or is it not? And if studying a rich neighborhood compared to a poor neighborhood and doing that genetically, well, why are you doing that? To what end? I think if you're just thinking, oh, we can study any population we want and we can characterize it genetically and we can put that in our data banks, and I'm just contributing to knowledge because I'm just describing the genetics of a group.
As David Wright was saying, no, in his book.
What?
As David Wright was saying in his book, no, that he's looking for, the way in which nature is distributed in megalopolis.
And we don't come packaged like that. And why you're pulling people together and studying them genetically matters. And if you're getting government funded, if your project is government funded, it should be beneficial and not harmful. So I think we could be stricter if we recognize that we are collecting people together for reasons that are embedded socially and politically, and then characterizing them genetically. To what end? You need to be able to justify that. And if it's to some of the stuff with polygenic scores in the US about level of school attainment, in a way that's still just looking to explain away the inequalities, the huge socioeconomic inequalities and the racial aspects of that because of the legacy of slavery, segregation, racial discrimination. That doesn't, I just think it doesn't need to be funded when we look at it in a practical way. This isn't just empirical knowledge to be had and we'll put it in the bank and maybe a scientist down the road will apply it. We're not working that, that research not being done in that framework. It's being done in a practical, social, political context with, certain purposes in mind. And, I think you should be able to justify the purposes that you're doing the research that you're doing. And it should be conducive to human well-being. And, so I guess that's what you just, when you start talking about, comparing, sort of an affluent neighborhood to a poor struggling neighborhood and doing that genetically, you need to justify that, not just think you're doing just truth for the sake of truth or whatever.
Exactly. From our perspective, and I'm sure many potential readers in Mexico, even if they are not working on these topics, would feel is that, so why choosing two places that are so stereotypically put at the extremes of the scale, no, of wealth versus poverty, for instance. No? Lisa, we're approaching the end of our session, but I still have a few more questions from which I will choose one or two, just to be able to take the chance to continue talking to you in this very, very interesting session. Thinking about the work that has been produced in Canada, from Canada, about all the topics that we have been talking about, and especially thinking about, the philosophy of science, I cannot avoid thinking about Ian Hacking, the late philosopher of science, who is so famous and influential in many different topics, and especially when in books such as Historical Ontology, he was dealing with how the processes of classification have this effect on how the world turns out to be. No? So do you have any comment as a philosopher of science from Canada about that kind of way of doing philosophy of science that could be, and actually have been, sometimes applied to issues related to race and racism in many different countries? I mean, the work of hacking has been very influential internationally, and I would really like to listen to your opinion about his work and the usefulness that it has, no, as a conceptual tool to continue, pushing forward on this research on our topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the value of Hacking's work is the work he's done within the human sciences, and developing an account of human kinds as opposed to natural kinds, and as the changing, the dynamic nature of humankinds, because we conceive ourselves, in certain ways, and bring about a way in which we are more that, or I guess if we fight against it, less that, and that's an ongoing process of the dynamic nature of humankinds, and I think that is helpful to think about in terms of understanding and race and ethnicity, and I think some people have tried to do some work towards that way. I was surprised that Ian Hacking wasn't in his work on biosocial kinds, and when he looked at race and genetics, I was surprised he wasn't more critical than he was. He sort of jumped on board the anti-Lewontin thing that Edwards, that came out of the Edwards critique of Lewontin, and Lewontin being, an ideologue about trying to minimize, between group differences, and I guess I was a bit disappointed that Hacking wasn't more critical, but I did in my paper on Lewontin jump off a long quote of Hacking's and try to show the way I think Hacking misunderstood Lewontin, but I think I expected but his work's been like for someone who's contributed to philosophy of science and done things that are so original and different within the discipline. I've always been quite in awe of Hacking and his contributions, and
Lisa, so as I said, there are still a few minutes to go. I wanted to ask you something very specific, and this might be probably the last or the yes question that I would be able to ask you. So, I mean, for a long time we've been reading and listening about these discussions and debates about race and ethnicity, and in many of your early work you were obviously analyzing and taking in on the way scientists use those categories or meta categories, we might say, And then recently, indigeneity was included, and actually in the report, the committee report that we have been analyzing today, and that you have been looking at so closely, we have the pair ethnicity/indigeneity. So, does it make a difference if we talk in these terms now? And this actually, I want to ask this question today at the end of the session, because in the next session in 2 weeks from today, we will have as our invited guest Jocelyn Che Santiago, who will be talking about these international advances of groups of people who have indigenous ancestry or ancestors to problematize it in the way that you showed us to do, who are at the same time doing genomics themselves or interested in shaping the way genomics for their own interests as peoples, First Nations, pueblos originarios, as we call them in Spanish sometimes, So Jocelyn will talk about this, and I wanted to not let go of the chance to ask you: is in the genetic something that we need now? What difference does it make that we talk about it critically from a meta-scientific perspective, but also in the communities of scientists who are realizing the importance of the category? What work is it doing, in your opinion?
I know you've thought about that a lot more than I have, so I should throw that back at you. I think, you know, science has to be made up of, you know, it has to look like our society, like our world, in order to be good science. You know, people need to be, you know, doing the science themselves in ways that are conducive to their ends, and the encouragement and the movement of students and graduate scientists, you know, from minority backgrounds, from who are indigenous and are working on you know, in disease research, for example, on diseases that are more prevalent in people who they identify with in their communities. It can only be good for science if they're genuinely in the driver's seat, you know, because too often they kind of get used, you know, to be the connection with the, you know, community, whether in biology, whether in anthropology, you know. But you know, it can, and congratulations on the first woman president, you know, in North America, elected in a general election. You know, it can only be better for society if our politicians look more like us. It can only be good for society if our scientists look more like us generally. So I think that's really important. The category indigenous, I mean, in Canada right now, it's very much, you know, has understood, I guess, in a framework right now of settler colonialism, in terms of that as being, you know, a sociological and anthropological framework. And you know, it often means that, you know, you're indigenous or you're a settler. I don't know if that's the most nuanced way of looking at history and how we got to where we're at. I think it's an important framework, but I think these are going to be how the category is understood is going, it changes in time. Like I said, I think right now in Canada, you know, that's an important way that indigeneity is being configured. But I'm sure that's different in Mexico. I'm sure it's different elsewhere. I'm sure there's enough commonality, you know, in worldwide indigenous organizations and movements, you know. But like, it's interesting in genetics and genomics, because of course, like, you know, people who have lived in, I don't know, Southwest, whose families have lived in Southwest England for generations and generations and generations, might, you know, be considered by population geneticists to be indigenous, you know, English people. That's not, of course, the way that those of us who are in, you know, colonized frameworks understand the significance of what it is to be indigenous. So, but I would be, if you have something to say, well, I know that you've thought about this.
Since we are almost over in terms of time, I want to take this chance to state again that we would love to have you in person in Mexico in a few months, if possible, to actually discuss in detail about these comparisons, because I think this is one of the places in which this not only interdisciplinary but international, transnational collaboration on these issues will give very interesting and useful fruits, I think, no, academically speaking, no.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I think we have to get out of the sort of a U.S.-centric framework of understanding these problems and sort of work collaboratively.
To enhance the diversity of the perspectives. Anyway, we're talking about diversity here, about the peoples who have been studied by scientists. We also need to reflect on diversity in our own perspectives and the way we as communities in different places work together, or could work together. Thank you very much, Lisa. So now I hand the session to Jimena, who will do the closure, the formal closure of our session. Thank you very much. It was a lovely experience. Many thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Many thanks, Professor Lisa Gannett, for sharing these very important questions for us. Even if not everyone in SURXE is specialized in these topics, you put these questions in the table. For example, what defines us, right? And it's very worrying that these ancestry companies, I was reading your presentation, is full of words like the true origin, right? Or
who you really are,
or discovering myself, or what I am. And all these kind of questions lead us on thinking of race somehow. No, the answer to these questions is something related to race, and this is very problematic. And we're kind of obsessed with this topic at this moment. And even if we are not geneticists or biological anthropologists, I think it's a very important question. How to talk about identity without talking necessarily about race, how to talk about ancestry without like implicitly meaning race. So yeah, and really you put a lot of elements on the table to understand how complex it is, how complex in terms of biology, but also cultural elements, symbolic elements, even social and of course psychological things. It's complex. And all of these elements are very rich inputs for the reflection of our seminar about what we are doing in general. And I agree that it's very important to ask ourselves now, how are we socially constructing the objects we work with? Scientifically, but also from science and also from the state. No? What are the elements we're putting together to socially construct the categories we're working with? So thank you a lot, Paco and you, for giving us more elements to making this question complex and leading us to richer reflections about it. So thank you very much. We'll keep on with these sessions. We have at least one more this year, and it would be amazing to have you, maybe just listening or whatever, but you're welcome anytime. And
thank you.
Hopefully we can see you in Mexico someday. And also thank you everyone else for connecting, sharing, and being in touch with our activities. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en la próxima. 18 de junio, aquí en el SURXE.
Presencialmente, como
Sí.
yo sé.
Gracias.
Gracias, Lisa.
Thank you.
Hasta la próxima.
Thank you very much.
Nos vemos.
Adiós.